now. Hi folks, we're just giving a few moments here at the top for Zoom to let everybody in before we get started with tonight's event. If you are already in tonight's webinar with us, you can open up your chat window, let us know where you're zooming in from, and you can also find some information about how to purchase tonight's featured book. Good evening and welcome to tonight's live online author event with Greenlight Bookstore. I'm Chelsea from Greenlight, and we're thrilled to host tonight's event with Andrew Erish presenting his new book, Vitagraph, America's first great motion picture studio. He'll be talking with Joel Dinerstein, so you're in for an excellent time. Before we start, I just want to say a huge thanks to Andrew, Joel, and the team at University Press of Kentucky for making this happen, and to all of you for showing up. We're grateful for your support and for the chance to make this space for conversation and connection. Now, just a couple of housekeeping things. In our Zoom webinar tonight, you can see and hear the speakers, but they cannot see or hear you. They can see that you're here though, and there are a couple of different ways you can interact with the authors and with each other throughout tonight's event, which we highly encourage. The first is the chat, which you can find by clicking on the icon that looks like one speech balloon. You're welcome to post your comments and thoughts in the chat. That's a great way to show your appreciation for the author and interact with fellow attendees. If you have a specific question you'd like to have answered by the author, please post that question in the Q&A module. You can find it by clicking on the icon that looks like two speech balloons. We'll be pulling questions only from the Q&A to be answered in the later part of the program. And importantly, tonight's featured book, Vitagraph, is available for sale from Greenlight Bookstore. You can shop in person from 10 a.m. to 9 p.m. at both our Fulton Street and Flatbush Ave stores, where you can purchase Andrew's book and many others on site. You can also order online at greenlightbookstore.com for a quick pickup at the store or for shipping anywhere in the US. I'll drop that buy link in the chat. As thanks for attending tonight's virtual event, we are offering 10% off the featured book. Enter coupon code GreenlightEvents10 into the coupon discount section at checkout online for 10% off. If you care about supporting the careers of authors and the ongoing existence of independent bookstores, buying tonight's featured book is a great way to show your support. Our interviewer tonight is Joel Dinerstein, who is the author of The Origins of Cool in Post-War America and American Cool, among other titles. He has been a consultant for popular music for HBO's Boardwalk Empire and the NEH, and is a professor in the English department of Tulane University. We'll be speaking with our featured author, Andrew Erish, an independent scholar of cinema and the author of Colonel William N. Selig, The Man Who Invented Hollywood. Andrew's new book, Vitagraph, is a new and comprehensive examination and reassessment of the company most responsible for defining and popularizing the American movie. Vitagraph, established here in Brooklyn in 1897 by J. Stuart Blackton, Albert E. Smith, was the leading producer of motion pictures for much of the silent and established America's studio system. Andrew is going to start us off with a reading from the book, and then he'll be talking with Joel and with all of you. Andrew and Joel, please take it away.
Thank you, Chelsea. All right, I'm going to read the opening and closing of the introduction, and then opening of chapter 2. Mention Vitagraph to most film buffs, and you are likely to receive one of 3 responses. You must mean Vitaphone, the people that made the Bugs Bunny cartoons, or you're saying it wrong. It's Biograph, or even more often, an uncomprehending stare. However, there was a time when everyone in the world who went to the movies knew that Vitagraph was the most popular maker of motion pictures. Vitagraph established the birth and development of motion pictures in America. The beginning of the story follows the familiar narrative of impoverished young immigrants who got off the boat with little more than a tenacious drive to pursue the American dream. It led them to an industry that hadn't even been invented yet. Inspired by Pathé's success, you'll have to read earlier in that paragraph after you buy the copy from Greenlight Books. Blackton and Smith decided to significantly expand their business in 1905. Vitagraph's expansion was slow and methodical. Virtually all American exhibitors included Pathé films in their programs. Vitagraph's success to this point was due largely to pop rock's urbane charm, driving good bargains with operators of vaudeville theaters and other venues that utilized the company's exhibition service. Rock accomplished much of this outside the office over drinks. Possessing neither the aptitude nor inclination for business, J. Stuart Blackton relished being the public face of Vitagraph as its artistic director. Thus, it fell upon the conscientious shoulders of Albert Smith to decide on and execute the policies and operations of the company. Among his many duties, Smith began making annual trips to Europe in 1903 to open up foreign markets for Vitagraph and scout the competition. Given his firsthand knowledge of the Pathé operation, it was Smith who convinced the others that they needed to forego rooftop filmmaking in Manhattan and instead construct a facility for the year-round production of story-based moving pictures. Having spent half his life in the Flatbush section of Brooklyn, Smith found a parcel of land in that area to establish what was then referred to as a manufacturing plant. The property in Greenfield, today commonly known as Midwood, was at Locust Avenue and East 15th Street on the southwest edge of Flatbush. Because the neighborhood was far from Manhattan, relatively speaking in those days, Vitagraph was able to purchase a 200 by 200 foot lot in August 1905 for approximately $1,000. The land bordered Brooklyn and Brighton Beach elevated railroad tracks near the Elm Avenue Rapid Transit Station, as well as adjacent parcels that could be purchased for future expansion. The dimensions of the company's initial building were approximately 50 by 100 feet. It took 13 months to complete at a total cost of $25,000. A studio took up half of the top floor and was large enough to accommodate at least 2 sets simultaneously. The ceiling and one wall were made of prismatic glass to diffuse sunlight evenly and thus eliminate harsh shadows. Adjacent to the studio were dressing rooms for the men and women, an office shared by Blackton and Smith. The ground floor contained a dark room for processing the film, an editing room, a costume department, and a machine shop where cameras and projectors were constructed. Props and scenic backdrops were built in the carpenter shop in the basement. Greenfield was not yet powered with electricity, and connecting the facility to the nearest Edison generating station was cost prohibitive. Thus, the basement also contained a diesel 100 horsepower generator operating a dynamo that supplied power. The original chimney was soon replaced with a smokestack towering over the facility on which Vitagraph was spelled out in vertically inlaid brick. The tallest structure in the neighborhood, it served as a beacon to all who dreamed of working in the movies. So that's a little sample, and without further ado, I turn it over to my dear friend and partner in crime, the eminent cultural historian, Professor Joel Dinerstein.
Well, yeah, I'm not doing anything from eminence tonight. This is all about this great book. So when I had to say a couple of things to introduce the Brooklyn aspect of this. When I first started reading my good friend Andy's book in manuscript, he gave me no warning of its unexpected personal connections. I grew up just off of Flatbush and Church Avenues, about a half mile from Greenlight's Flatbush branch. I went to Erasmus Hall High School. I spent my childhood in Prospect Park, where a lot of Vitagraph's films were shot. So to find out that the first major movie studio was an enormous compound in Brooklyn, employing many Erasmus graduates, and a lot of them women, was a strange and wonderful convergence of scholarship and friendship. So my first question, Andy, is this is a minor question, but when did you decide to write a book about Vitagraph? I mean, I've known you a long time, and I'd heard you talk about your first book about Colonel Selig, the man who invented Hollywood, forever, ever since I've known you. So had you always planned to write about Vitagraph, or did it grow organically out of the Selig book?
The latter. It grew organically out of the Selig. As I'm doing all my Selig research, everything I'm reading keeps going back to Vitagraph, and they were truly the biggest motion picture company in America and eventually the world. And there was one book written about Vitagraph that was 100 pages long, a good introduction, but boy, I wanted to learn more. And one of the founders published his autobiography, Albert Smith, back in 1952. And even when I didn't know much about the company, there were a few things that kind of raised some red flags, as if, oh, he's doing what everybody else that's ever worked in the movies did. He's lying his rear end off about stuff, about some things. And yet I quickly understood, because of Selig's accomplishments, Vitagraph must have done some amazing things that didn't need any extra fudging in terms of, you know, making things even crazier than they were.
Yeah, no, I mean, both these books do a tremendous amount of work and damage, I may say proper damage, to the myth making of early Hollywood that the studios have created. So I'll start sort of at the beginning in a way of getting introduced to the, you know, our two protagonists, Albert Smith and James Stuart Blackton. So chapter 1, by the way, which I hope is anthologized forever in film studies courses, because chapter 1 shows the continuity in the entertainment formats of the late 1800s, from vaudeville to variety, from all male entertainment to family entertainment, from magic lantern shows to motion pictures. And you do this pretty organically by starting in the early 1890s with the two protagonists, because they had to be aware and have their fingers in all of this, because you have a rapidly transforming business that has not codified. So toward that end, I want you to tell me a little bit about, I mean, you say how they differentiate themselves from the rest of the young speculators, about how their show business experience led to using their skill and craft to enhance a viewing of Edison's The Black Diamond Express, one of those early great films about trains.
You know, it's a good example of, like you say, what set these guys apart from the others. Blackton and Smith, along with Colonel Selig, who was operating in Chicago, are really the only American filmmakers that started out as entertainers. Everyone else came from other businesses, whatever, and kind of found movies as something they either really enjoyed, were glamorous, or they could make more money out of than their previous business. Because Smith and Blackton were born at the right time. Like you say, they were at the intersection of a lot of different kind of entertainment. Edison made a movie called The Black Diamond Express. Actually, it wasn't even Edison. It was people working for him. Edison himself never made a movie, never got his hands dirty building equipment or anything. But this was one of the first ripoffs in film history, because they were actually remaking a movie by the Lumiere brothers that had shocked people in Paris. Same thing. Train pulls into a train station. It was movement for the sake of movement. And for the first audiences of movies, incredible. Seeing, you know, it was one thing to see still photos, which were still a relatively new thing, but to see moving pictures incredible. So everyone everywhere was showing either the Lumiere film or the Edison film. And all they were doing was just running this, against a sheet or a white wall or whatever. Blackton and Smith were entertainers. Smith, as he's running the projector of the film, Blackton's behind the screen with a train whistle and various strings connected to his hands and arms, banging pots and pans and blowing into the train whistle and making clattering garbage can lids and things like that, as if a real train is approaching. And all of it's not just one of these urban myths. People really did freak, especially when Blackton and Smith were showing this film. They thought a train had broken through the wall, and the people in the front rows especially were trampling over each other, trying to get out of the way.
Yeah.
I wish, I can't remember those days as well as I used to.
Yeah, right. Back then, when they were just breaking the third wall.
Yeah,
wasn't really
exactly.
the fourth wall, right?
Exactly.
No, all those things happened back then, right?
Yeah.
And so what you described sounds a lot like, what early radio was like, right? When sound effects were everything.
Yeah.
And this is,
and it was only sound effects. Yeah.
right. And this is 20 years before that.
Yeah.
So let's get back to Brooklyn a little bit. So, I mean, I know that I want to hear a little bit about, I know that they were operating in Manhattan. And so part of my question is, why did they move to Brooklyn? And what that had to do with them meeting the legendary and infamous William T. Pop Rock. And Pop Rock has to be the greatest name in popular culture history, right?
Yeah.
But also, there's a lot in your book about the socioeconomic state of Brooklyn at the time that both affects the content of the films and the move. So,
which is huge, and it endures to this day in really interesting ways. They started out, Blackton and Smith started making films on the rooftop of a building on Nassau Street in Lower Manhattan that they had access to. They rented offices in the building. And imagine they built a platform stage to perform on. And in the earliest days, one of them would work the camera and one of them would do magic tricks in front of the camera. And then they would change places, they would direct each other as it's going on. But it was on a rooftop in Lower Manhattan. People would stop what they were doing in the surrounding buildings and watch these movies being made. And it reminds me of the Beatles' last concert, on the rooftop of the Apple headquarters. Everyone stops what they're doing to watch the Beatles.
I was just going to say that.
Yeah,
go ahead.
Smith and Blackton are doing this 100 years earlier. So you're on a little platform on a roof, you can only do so much. And the British and the French were ahead of everyone else in showing that story films that were a little more complex were what people started to really gravitate for. It was no longer movement for the sake of movement. So, although they were born in England, Smith especially stayed in Brooklyn for a long time. And it was only natural for him. They didn't have a lot of money. It took them 2 years to save up enough money to just acquire a projector and build their own camera and stuff like that. These guys had nothing. So when they were able to scrape up some money to try to create a bigger place and a weatherproof place to make movies all year round, naturally, well, let's do it in Flatbush. And the property that Smith found, I don't know if it's in the book or not. Smith was told when he purchased the property that it had been a last stop on the Underground Railroad that led people from the South into safety in Brooklyn. And a lot of Black people were settling in that area of Flatbush at the time. It had been farmland for a long time. so they could afford to do it. And you draw from the local workforce. You talked about Erasmus Hall. There were so many people that went to Erasmus Hall that went into the movies. It's ridiculous. I would put Erasmus Hall up against Hollywood High to see who has more graduates that,
All right.
before the camera.
So hold that thought, because I want to ask that question this way, right? I'm going to ask about my alma mater, right?
Sure.
But and I love how many Erasmus graduates are working at Vitagraph, and how many of them are women in all kinds of positions, which I assume is anomalous in the early film industry, but I don't know well enough, so you will speak to. But I want to ask how Erasmus fits into the story, and I want you to frame it around two people. One of the great actresses of silent film, Norma Talmadge, right, who starts out at Vitagraph, and one of Erasmus's famous dropouts, Mo Howard of the Three Stooges. So I want to hand it off that way.
Okay. You may have heard of Norma Talmadge. If you've ever seen the movie Intolerance, you've seen her sister, Constance Talmadge, who plays the mountain girl in Intolerance. If you're a Buster Keaton fan, you know that their third sister, Natalie, was married to Buster Keaton in one of the most unhappy marriages of all time.
It's a high bar. Sorry.
It is. Their mother, Peg, was one of the first movie stage mothers. And Norma fell in love as a teenager at Erasmus, fell in love with the movies, especially Vitagraph's first credited performer, who was a woman who had been known for a couple of years as the Vitagraph girl until they started to give her credit under her own name. And she was one of the first two salaried movie performers to be credited by name, and that was Florence Turner. And Norma's mother, Peg, brought her to Vitagraph one day. It's in the neighborhood. You go. Is there any work?
You take the bus and you go.
You go. Or you walk. Some of these people were so dirt poor. Right. Norma was a very pretty girl. I think she was 15 when she showed up at Vitagraph. And she had the great fortune. This was in 1911. Vitagraph was making, I believe it was the first movie version of A Tale of Two Cities.
Oh.
And if you've ever read the book or seen the 1935 version or whatever, you know that as Sidney Carton is being led to the guillotine at the end, there's a young girl that he shares the cart, the tumbrel with, as he's being led. And she discovers that he's not the guy that's supposed to be killed, that he's sacrificing himself. And this gives her comfort. And she dies before him, and then he's, silently, "'Tis a far, far better thing I do," and all that.
Right.
She literally, because of that, became a star overnight.
Wow.
Florence Turner was Lucy Monet in the film, and she was the lead female in the movie. Norma Talmadge got more press.
Wow.
Just from that one scene. But Albert Smith revealed, it didn't require much. It just required this beautiful, innocent face and this girl who can show fear, and then is calmed by what this guy is about to do and his sacrifice. Smith said it took years to turn her into a good actress. And by the time she left Vitagraph, she was a good actress and was one of the major actresses in the 1920s. So to your other person of note, Mo Howard. If you've ever read Mo Howard's autobiography, who hasn't? I believe it's chapter 2. He talks about his first experiences in the movies, and it's about Vitagraph, and it's about wanting to be in the movies. And he becomes, initially, he's a gopher for a couple of the biggest stars. Maurice Costello, who starred as Sidney Carton, coincidentally, in A Tale of Two Cities, who was the first matinee idol of the movies, and John Bunny, who was the first worldwide popular comedian before anyone else. Mo is running errands for these guys as a kid. And then when they would need a kid, hey, you want to be in the movies? And he's in the right place at the right time. He wrote his book, 60 years after these experiences. So he doesn't name a particular, I don't think he remembered the title of this particular film, but he said there was a film that I had a good part in with glamour gal Lillian Walker, who was in Erasmus Grab, and John Bunny as the star. And as I'm looking at hundreds and hundreds of Vitagraph films in archives around the world, I'm keeping an eye out. Okay, Mo said he's in some Vitagraphs.
Right.
I'm looking for all kinds of stuff, but okay, where's Mo? And sure enough, there's a movie called Mr. Bolter's Infatuation, and there's a kid who plays the call boy at this burlesque theater, and John Bunny is smitten with the lead actress played by Lillian Walker, and he gives a note to Mo to give to Lillian Walker. I'd like to meet you. He's waiting by the stage door. And Mo Howard, at the age of, I think he was 13, walks into the room without knocking into the ladies' dressing room. He's smoking a cigarette and nonchalantly hands the note to them and then brings the response back. And it kind of like, I don't know if it was his first film, but it was, as he recalled, his biggest part. And the only one I've been able to identify fairly conclusively that it is indeed Mo Howard. So, I mean, if you lived in Brooklyn especially, you knew who Vitagraph was, you knew they were in the neighborhood, and so many people wanted to be a part of it. Yeah. It's just incredible. The importance of it in Brooklyn, the legacy of that. Check this out. I write my book about Colonel Seelig, and Seelig had a couple of great contributions to movies. One being, you might remember a movie called The Great Train Robbery. Made in New Jersey. It's a good movie. When it's made in New Jersey, it's made with guys that never got on horses before. But, there's parts of it that are embarrassingly bad, but it's still a good movie in spite of that. Seelig had been making documentaries in the West, starting around 1900 in the Rockies. And it was his brilliant idea, let me make story films in the West. And then ultimately that led to him establishing the first studio in Los Angeles and everything. You make movies about the place you're in. The Western would have died as so many genres, the beach party movie, the motorcycle movie, all the genres we've lived through, had the Western not moved to the West. So take that idea, bring it back to Brooklyn. Here are these two young go-getters, Smith and Blackton, and they typify the zeitgeist of young America and the yearnings of people everywhere in the world that want to succeed. And people are starting to move into the cities, move out of the farms. They're starting to have urban experiences. They're starting to become familiar with urban landscapes and a more sophisticated way of living and doing things. And by shooting on the streets of Brooklyn with Brooklyn people, Smith and Blackton are writing their own scripts for several years until they start to develop a whole team of writers and everything. They're writing stories about themselves. They're writing stories about their, everyday life that's happening in Brooklyn right now that reflect their values, their attitudes, and all that. And the world starts to get accustomed to a New York cityscape. That's the right term.
It is.
So if you look at the legacy, every studio to this day, unless things have changed in the post-COVID era, still has a New York backlot. That New York backlot is because Vitagraph identified a vast majority of movies as taking place in that kind of location. So everyone, they're not shooting in Brooklyn anymore, but they have to recreate it. You know, they don't know it anymore, but that's the legacy of, we're still focusing stories in urban places that look like this, that begins with these guys. The business was poised at one point to move to Florida and settle in Jacksonville. But Vitagraph was so big and Selig was so big that thank goodness it didn't happen, because American movies would not look like and have the kinds of stories, had they settled in Jacksonville, that they ended up having. And I can't imagine the kinds of genres that would have developed and things like that, that we just take for granted now, that really came organically out of where Vitagraph especially, and Selig to an extent, started.
Well, you know, when I was reading this at first, and then I realized that, you know, Edison is over in Menlo Park in New Jersey, right? I mean, that's where the whole, and so, right. So the whole idea that Hollywood starts it is like, well, actually, all those early movies are actually here on the East Coast, right?
Right.
But I do want you to talk a little more. I mean, the thing that, besides the Brooklyn aspect of it, I was most surprised by how many women were employed at Vitagraph and in how many key roles. I mean, as far as I remember, in every role: production, directing, script writing, etc. And I want you to talk a little about that and tell me whether, I know that there were more women in those roles actually in early Hollywood than later, but I don't know how anomalous the Vitagraph hiring scenario or gender parity was, and I'm sure it wasn't gender parity.
It wasn't, but I'll tell you, it was. When you think about women in the workforce back then, there was a larger percentage of women in the Vitagraph workforce than you would see in virtually any other industry at that point. Selig as well employed a fair amount of women, but Vitagraph much more. They had a much bigger operation and all that. When I mentioned in passing earlier, Blackton and Smith created everything. They had to. It was just the two of them. So you build your own equipment, you write your own stories, you direct your own stories, you act in your own stories and all that. You build your business. Thank goodness they had Pop Rock, who we'll get to in a second, to help grow that business. But eventually, you're just churning out movie after movie. You can't do it all anymore. So by necessity, they had to train people in specialized roles to get that going. Here's how you build a camera. Here's how you photograph a movie. Here's what we're looking for in stories. People started to send scripts to Brooklyn, hundreds every week. And there are some amazing archives that just list, we paid $5 to so-and-so in Keokuk, Iowa for this story.
Right, to Andrew Erish.
Yeah, it's amazing. So by 1910, 1910, everything is specialized in individual departments. The first head of the script department was a fellow named Joel Dinerstein, who ended up starting their West Coast operation, opened up their West Coast studio. To replace him in 1911, they hired a woman named, I think the first was Betta Bruel, to head the script department. And she had mostly a staff of women who would read submissions, script readers, and comment on the submissions. They were trained, okay, this is no good, this would never work. If they would approve of something, then it would go to her, she would read it and say, okay, we might need to tweak this a little bit, but this is going to make a good film, because she knows where Smith and Blackton are at, what their tastes are like, what works for Vitagraph, what people are going to see. And then those things would be passed on to Smith and Blackton, and they would give the final okay. But that script department ran for years, run by women and largely staffed by women. I don't know that I mentioned it in the book, but in the the same thing happened when the LA studio opened in 1912 or so. There was a woman named Doris Schroeder who ran the script department in Los Angeles. And she also herself, besides fielding everyone else's, and by the way, the actors and actresses were also writing scripts and trying to make some extra money selling scripts as well. You know, your nephew was writing scripts. Everybody was writing scripts and wanting to, you know, get their stories into movies. But Doris Schroeder was specialized in writing Westerns. And she's writing tons and tons and tons of Vitagraph Westerns throughout the teens. And she later went on, if you're a Hopalong Cassidy fan, and who isn't, look at the credits on maybe the first 10 or 15 years of Hopalong Cassidy films. More often than not, they're written by Doris Schroeder. She was one of those people who just kept going. She did it well, and she kept writing Westerns, successful Westerns, into the top era.
Wow. I mean, I know, I mean, these are the kind of stories that sort of, I loved reading it and was always surprised by. So 42 years before the Dodgers, Vitagraph left Brooklyn for Los Angeles.
Well, you know what? They didn't close down Brooklyn to go to LA.
Oh, okay.
They opened a LA studio simultaneous. You know, people weren't liking the Brooklyn Westerns any more than the New Jersey Westerns. And once Selig started doing the, you know, Westerns in the real West, I saw one of the Brooklyn Westerns. You know, Prospect Park is not a good double for the American West, especially when you've already seen it and everything. So they had to. Yeah. They had to open a studio.
So let me ask a quick follow-up. Is it because by 1915, the film industry is becoming pretty entrenched in Hollywood? Is that why they opened a West Coast office? Or was it just to make Westerns?
It was initially to make Westerns. It wasn't entrenched yet. There were, you know, Selig opens his first studio there in early 1909. And it took a while for other studios to follow his lead, but he's making so much money, they start to trickle out there. So Vitagraph follows about 3 years later, and the kind of pendulum didn't swing towards the West fully until about 1914, 1915. So they were already there, and it was one of the reasons as well. They were just making so much money. They were the first company in the world to make $1 million profit.
Wow.
In a year. And this is when people are paying a nickel to go to the movies.
Wow.
And this is when their $1 million profit was mostly on their foreign stuff, because Edison had rigged the legal system so that he was getting most of their domestic profit. So in reality, Vitagraph was probably making $2 million a year in profit, but half of that was going to Edison. And you can't imagine how big it was, or how many people. I've got the figures in the book. I think by 1909, Nickelodeon started to really show up prominently as purpose-built or created motion picture spaces in 1905. And I think by 1909, there were something like 8,000 in the United States. It just exploded, and all around the world as well. And
yeah, I know.
Vitagraph was everywhere.
This is slightly, not quite a digression, but one of the first things I learned from you many, many, many years ago about the film industry that I recall is that when we would talk about the history of film and box office grosses and how big movies were, and you would always just like dismiss anything I said and say, look, the movie industry sold more tickets, which is what we're really talking about, not grosses, but more tickets in the 1920s to Chaplin and Keaton films than ever after that, and it's not even close. And that was a real sort of eye opener for me about, you know, what movies meant to Americans, how many people saw them. You know,
not only Americans, but people around the world.
Of course,
and you know, the crazy thing is, during the silent era, D.W. Griffith said, we've got a universal language since the Tower of Babel. You know, we can communicate with everyone.
And as
so
you
let's,
mentioned,
let's be responsible. Let's tell good stories responsibly. And Griffith did, except for the big elephant in the room, Birth of a Nation.
Right.
But otherwise,
right.
But Vitagraph being the leader,
right.
Everyone in the world preferred their movies.
Yeah.
The French have a reputation for snobbery. And yet, according to the figures I found, as many French people preferred Vitagraph as to any French-made film. And in virtually every other country, more people in England preferred Vitagraph than any British-made film, Germany, Italy. There was a kind of parity with France as well. But, Vitagraph sent a bunch of the talent from Brooklyn on an around the world filmmaking expedition. The Vitagraph Globetrotters, they were called, led by Maurice Costello. And he would go into some places that didn't have movies yet, and they didn't know who he was. I mean, literally around the world, it took them 6 months.
Right.
But where he went into places where there were movies, Costello was mobbed. Wow. And there were accounts of him being mobbed in Rome that are just stunning. Like you would think, back to the Beatles, the opening to A Hard Day's Night is Maurice Costello in Rome. It's crazy. And, another interesting Brooklyn thing is all these folks lived in Brooklyn. They lived near the studio. You live near where you work, right? But this guy is the first matinee idol. He's the kind of guy men like. He's a good, rugged guy, whatever, but he's a good looking guy too. Every girl and woman in the world had a crush on this guy. So you're living in Brooklyn, he starts getting knocks on the door. You're listed in the phone book, you're getting telephone calls. There's tons and tons of women showing up at your front door all hours of the day and night, every day of the week. It was not good for his marriage. So he finally had to move to a secluded place, I think maybe in Great Neck. It's in the book, just to have the privacy and try to protect the marriage.
Well, as you said earlier, I mean, the movies become a certain sort of set of models for how you adapt to modernity. You just moved to the city, you don't know how to move. But you're really watching for models of how to behave.
You're watching the movies, how to behave. Right. Absolutely.
Yeah. So I wanted to say, first of all, I wanted to also say the book is a sort of a joy to read and not academic at all, of course. But I love sentences like this that just sometimes show up, right? And I think this is the beginning of a chapter, but I don't remember. And this is about one of their more famous actors, Larry Seamon. I think it's Seamon, S-E-M-O-N. Actor Larry Seamon was born in a trunk and spent half his life assisting his magician father. Now, that's just a great sentence. Like, if a student of mine wrote that sentence, I would not consider giving it less than a B, no matter what else was in it, right? It's like, he's born in the trunk and spent half his life assisting his magician father. And although this is halfway through the book, it also continues the theme of all these overlapping entertainment industries that are coexisting: vaudeville, variety, magic lantern, even minstrelsy. And so you get a sense that this is all happening until it sort of winds up that film is the biggest industry of all, and everything kind of moves into that. But that part of it is really, you keep all those sort of themes happening. So, it's not like one of the things I've always appreciated about you as a film historian is that you're really interested in the continuities and not the discontinuities. Not like that was the past and then suddenly we had a studio system, right? Anybody who knows and has lived through any period of time knows that is not how it works, not how businesses work, not how people work. And there's a lot of scholarship in every field that does that. Like, here's how it was before World War II. And then in 1945, suddenly it's this, right?
Yeah. Anytime I see the phrase, suddenly this happened, I close the book. It's like, no, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about.
Right. And so your book not only does that very gracefully, but you're also a very good writer, very good narrative writer. And there's like nothing academic. It's a very accessible book for anybody who is interested in anything, the Brooklyn aspects of it, the early film industry, the entertainment industry. So I guess my last question will be, even though it's jumping ahead, so what causes, I mean, I know that Vitagraph peaks in the 19 teens, but what causes the end of Vitagraph? I know you say that Warner Brothers bought the studio and all its assets in 1925 for something like the equivalent of $10 million today. But so how did it reach the point of closing shop?
You know, there were three factors, and I go into great detail about each of these in the book. The first being World War I. If you're the biggest film company in the world and you have this enormous overhead and you're supplying theaters all over the place, and all of a sudden, a lot of these places are America's enemy and aren't importing movies anymore, or there's naval blockades to places that are America's allies and you can't get your films there, you're losing so much of what you counted on. And to their credit, Vitagraph's opening up South America, Australia, Asia during World War I to compensate for that. So literally by the, a certain point in the war, they really are everywhere in the world. They had the best distribution system worldwide of anyone. Second factor, there were some businessmen led by a guy named Benjamin Hampton. I shouldn't even mention him by name, but he tried to do a hostile takeover in a very sneaky way of Vitagraph, comes in from outside of the business and says, I represent men with $25 million who want to invest in your company, and ultimately Vitagraph will take over the world. And unfortunately, Albert Smith, who showed great sobriety in his business decisions, fell for it. And he got pushed out for a few months until he could get the company back. But it cost so much money that they were having to catch up all the time on the financial cost of regaining the company. And these people never did invest a penny in the company. And the third thing was Adolf Zucker of Paramount, who took over Paramount in a hostile takeover, did not want any of the old companies around because he wanted credit for starting the movie industry. So it was to his vanity and to his pocketbook, I gotta get rid of Vitagraph. They're the competition. I gotta get rid of them. And he's telling everyone that's writing the first books, and this guy Hampton that tried the hostile takeover wrote the first book that was circulated around the world, film history book from America. And of course, he's the biggest liar of them all. Adolf Zucker was the second biggest liar of them all. But Zucker shut out, he owned chains and chains of movie theaters, which was something that Vitagraph promised all of the people that they had worked with. We will never open a chain of theaters because we respect you guys. You've been there for us all these years. And Zucker could care about anybody. And he was, taking over chains, blowing up theaters if they didn't cooperate with him and stuff like that.
So Zucker is like, I'm going to buy the company and erase them from history. And
well, he didn't buy them. He just shut them out. And then Warner Brothers came in and bought them.
All right. Well, I know that we want to get to some of the questions from the audience. So I'm going to bow out and hand it back over to Chelsea.
All right.
Yeah, we've got a few questions here. Jerome would like to know, where did you research the papers and films for the book?
A lot of places. Albert Smith, most of his papers are at UCLA. Most of Blackton's material is at the Margaret Herrick Library in Beverly Hills. There are also the Warner Brothers papers, because Warner Brothers bought the company. There are all these business papers in the Warner Brothers archive at USC. There's also the Los Angeles County Museum of Natural History. that has a lot of Vitagraph stuff too, which there's some really weird and cool stuff in there. There are the three big repositories of actual Vitagraph films are in the Library of Congress, has the most Vitagraphs in the United States, a few hundred. The Film Museum in Amsterdam, Film Museum, which is the National Film Archive of the Netherlands, which speaks to how big Vitagraph was in the Netherlands for its existence. And the third, with the largest collection of Vitagraphs anywhere in the world, is the British Film Institute. It is stunning. I mean, they have more films than I think every other archive put together. Wow. Vitagraph was so big in England. And then there are other kind of smaller places, Eastman House in Rochester, New York. There's there are a couple of Italian film archives. There's a French film archive. Lobster Films was very gracious in sending me some copies online for research purposes and stuff. It's amazing what's out there. So those are some of them. And I should mention before you ask the next question, the Netherlands archive, Film Museum, has posted all of their Vitagraph collection online. You can look at all that stuff on YouTube. So if you see a movie that piques your interest after you buy the book from Greenlight, and you see a film and it's like, oh, I'd like to see that. Check out and see if it's online. If it's coming from the Netherlands archive, the prints are gorgeous because they found this, they were given this stash of original prints that hadn't been run through projector in 100 years. And the preservation is awesome. Some of the prints that you'll find on YouTube generally are in horrible condition, but use a little discernment in what you're looking at. You'll have fun.
See, we've also got some curiosity in the Q&A about, is the tower still there in Brooklyn? It's the only surviving structure of the Brooklyn studio, unfortunately. The facility ultimately in the 60s became a yeshiva, and that was torn down around the time I was working on the book. And by the time I got out to Brooklyn to tour the area, there was just rubble with the smokestack still remaining. And the smokestack, I believe, now has historic preservation status, but there's now an apartment building taking up that block, which is called the Vitagraph, but it ain't the same. Let's see. Gary would like to know, Andrew, why are you not a regular host on TCM? You know what?
I want to know that too.
All right. I'll give you the honest answer, and this will make sure that I'm never a regular host on TCM. They have put forth so many alleged documentaries about the history of the movies that are so wrong. I can't tell you how I cringe every time I see another one of their documentaries come on. And it's like, oh, I just can't believe this. And I've met with them a lot over the years, and they just aren't that interested. I think if they had me on, it would just blow a lot of their shtick and make them look bad. So that's that. Do you have a biggest pet peeve, misconception, or outright lie about the movie history? You know what? Yes, and it's something that I used to be guilty of myself, and I'm getting better at this. I used to trust what I read in books. I used to trust the reminiscences of the old timers. Adolf Zucker lived till he was 100. So if Adolf Zucker says, I started the business, who's going to doubt a nice little 100-year-old man? You know, he's been around forever. But every book ever written about the history of the movies is wrong. There will inevitably be errors in my books, and I hope someone fixes that, after I'm gone? And let's just get it right. The stories are amazing. The real stories are so much better than the lies that have been told over the years about everybody. Everybody that's been in this business has great stories. There's so many cool characters. There's so many weird things going on, or exciting creative things going on. Let's not be afraid of the truth, and whatever it is, tell it. If I'm wrong, call me on it, But go back to original sources. And I always go by Mosaic law. You've got to have 2 or 3 witnesses to establish the authenticity of something. So I tried to do that. And if you read the Vitagraph book, I call out the Vitagraph guys for propagating lies about themselves and about Vitagraph so-called achievements that just weren't true. I don't spare anybody. So I don't want to spare myself. If I'm wrong, write your book and tell the truth,
I also want to plug Andy's book. It has, we haven't talked about this, there's a lot of really vital images, movie posters, promo shots of the actors and actresses, screenshots of the films. The visuals are an important component of the book. Just wanted to make sure people knew that.
Yeah. It was fun paring those down. I only had so many I could choose from.
Of course. Yeah.
I had a full head of hair before that. I can't put that one in.
Let's see. We have one more question coming in from Martin McKenna to close us out. Can I find the book in public libraries?
If it's not in your public library, ask your public library to order it. Right now, I have a way of tracking it online, and it's only in, the last time I checked, about 220 libraries around the world. My Selig book is in, I believe, 650 libraries around the world, maybe more. So, contact your library and ask them to purchase it. Put it on the shelf so it's available for other people. If you can afford to buy the book, do not buy it from Amazon. They're more evil than you can imagine. Buy it from Greenlight Books. They've been kind enough to host this thing. Let's show our appreciation.
Thank you so much, Andrew. And thank you both for such a wonderful conversation tonight. And thank all of our attendees for coming out and sharing this space with us for this conversation. Like Andrew said, a reminder that you can get Vitagraph from Greenlight. If you're local to us here in Brooklyn, we're open 10 a.m. to 9 p.m. or you can order at greenlightbookstore.com for shipping anywhere in the US. You can find that book by link and the chat, and the coupon code Greenlight Events 10 for 10% off. Thank you all so much again for a lovely evening, and have a wonderful rest of your night.
Thanks, Chelsea.
Thanks, Chelsea. Thanks, Andy.
Thanks, Joel.
Take it easy.
Bye-bye.